afternoon, everyone. For those of you still getting sandwiches and lunch, please feel free to do that. For those of you watching on webcast, we would like to welcome you. And for those of you who have made the journey here, we appreciate your presence here today. On behalf of Dean Claudio Grossman, the faculty, staff, and students of American University Washington College of Law, I would like to welcome you today. My name is Hadar Harris, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law here at the Law School. We're holding today's event as part of the Center's ongoing and expanding work in our program on the human rights of persons with disabilities. And we are thrilled to be partnering today with the National Council on Disabilities for the launch of this very important report. This program of the Center's, like much of the work of our Center for Human Rights, aims to bridge and expand upon the intersections of emerging issues in human rights and humanitarian law. The work of the Center in the field of the rights of persons with disabilities has expanded over time since 2006, as many of you have joined us for a variety of conferences, panels, workshops, strategic convenings, and thought sessions. I'm going to generously call them thought sessions, as opposed to anything more critical than that, about the work of the CRPD, its meaning, its adoption, and strategies for its meaningful implementation. Today's event is part of that continuum as we will talk and think about Article 32 on international cooperation of the CRPD and its relevance and resonance with the work of American foreign assistance. So we are thrilled and really pleased to have been able to work together with the National Council on Disabilities to bring this event together. I want to thank Joan DeRocher for her initiative in reaching out to us. I'd also like to thank Whitney Hayes, who's our program coordinator, for all of the work that she and our Dean's Fellows have done to put today's events together. I also would be remiss if I did not mention two additional upcoming events which will be happening here at the Law School in the coming weeks. On April 3rd, as part of our annual conference on emerging issues in international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, we will be hosting the winners of our student writing competition, where we had submissions from 11 different countries around the world. And in the afternoon session from 12:15 until 2:30, we will be having an expert roundtable discussion on the intersection of international humanitarian law and the rights of persons with disabilities. We think that it will be an interesting and pretty cutting-edge discussion and hope that many of you will be able to either join us in person or to join us on live webcast. In addition, on Friday, April 5th, our program on intellectual property and information justice, in collaboration with the Disability Rights Law Society, the Disability Rights Clinic, and our center, will be holding a day-long conference on the intersection of intellectual property and the rights of persons with disabilities and accessible design. Correct? Is that it's something like that. And so it's a very interesting day-long conference on Friday, April 5th, that will also be taking place here. So I wanted to mention those two events. And if you are interested in finding out more about our work, there is information on the table. My job is to now introduce Jonathan Young, who will say a few words of welcome. He's the partner and general counsel at Fox Kaiser, and brings extensive experience in law and public policy, including his past service as the chair of the National Council on Disability. His biography, as the bios of all of our speakers today, are available on a sheet over there. It is long, impressive, and important, and I would point you to looking at all of the bios of our speakers today, but in the interest of time, I will cut it short and hand over the welcome to Jonathan Young. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Hadar, for your kind introduction, and I'm very much pleased to join all of you here today to commemorate the release of this important report toward the full inclusion of people with disabilities. And I'm very grateful to NCD's still relatively newly appointed chairperson, Jeff Rosen, for inviting me to participate in today's event. And to dispel any potential confusion, let me note that when you look inside the report, that the report went to print before my departure as chairman of NCD, so my name is listed there as transmitting the report, but really this is now a product of Jeff Rosen as chair of the council, but I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here, sort of, getting the band back together, as it were. Although I'm no longer affiliated with NCD now, I am truly honored to be associated with the fine work reflected in this report. And on behalf of NCD, I'd like to thank you, Hadar, and the entire Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at the American University, Washington College of Law, for partnering with NCD on this event and making the space available. I should note it's been a while since I've been in a law school classroom, but the last one was actually here when I was studying for the bar. I also want to thank Alison DeFranco and Janet Lord and everyone at Blue Law International for working with NCD on this long-awaited report, and a really incredible group of advisors that was assembled, Nora Gross, Eric Rosenthal, Michael Stein, Ann Hayes, and Jerry Mendez. And we're very grateful to Judy Heumann, who's here with us today from the Department of State, and Charlotte McLean-Napo from USAID. All right. Fair enough. And I'd also like to single out one person. While my name might be associated with the report, all of the work at NCD around international affairs really has been largely attributed to Joan DeRocher, the partner and general counsel at NCD, who has worked tirelessly to ensure that NCD's work doesn't stop at the shores of the United States and recognizes the important role of globalization around the world. So, Joan, thank you for all your incredible leadership. We have an incredible panel here today, and so I want to get to the panel, but Jeff asked me to say a few words, and let me just briefly say, for those of you not familiar with the National Council on Disability, it is a small independent agency consisting of 15 presidential appointees and a staff of about a dozen full-time staff, and the NCD's charge is to advise the President and Congress on all aspects of disability policy. It's a sweeping mission because we're charged with covering all aspects of disability. And some might wonder, well, why be engaged on international aspects? Why not just stay focused on things here at home? Well, there are more than 1 billion people worldwide with a disability. Fully 15% of the entire world's population are people with disabilities. And that stunning and documented fact underscores why NCD's work and today's panel discussion is so important. Each year, the United States invests billions of dollars in foreign assistance programs that build infrastructures, boost economies, and promote democracy and human rights around the world. However, we can't meet our foreign development goals if we invest in an inaccessible global marketplace. We can't ensure that Americans with disabilities have equal opportunities to participate in the global marketplace if the goals of the ADA have geographical borders. And we can't advance democracy and human rights without respecting the rights to full participation of 1 billion people with disabilities worldwide. So as we look at the issues today, we really start with the goals of the ADA: equal opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for all people with disabilities. And again, that needs to be a worldwide endeavor, not just an American endeavor. The United States has a proud international legacy due to its leadership regarding enactment of the ADA 23 years ago, and I'm proud to say it was the NCD that first recommended and drafted the Americans with Disabilities Act. But leadership must be sustained and not squandered to have a lasting credibility. As the panel will discuss today, NCD's report reviews a variety of micro-level and macro-level interventions that the United States can pursue to build on its proud history of disability policy leadership. We remain hopeful and confident that the departments and agencies to whom NCD's recommendations are directed will ensure that our efforts abroad abide by the goals of the ADA. Of course, the United States' ability to exercise global leadership is hindered by the United States Senate's failure to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I know many of you gathered here today continue to work tirelessly toward United States ratification, and NCD joins you in hoping that the United States will, at long last, continue a proud bipartisan tradition of support for disability rights and join the rest of the world in embracing the CRPD, and you'll certainly hear more about that shortly. It's now my privilege to introduce NCD's chairperson, Jeff Rosen. Jeff brings an extraordinary wealth of experience to his new role as NCD chairperson, including 7 years as NCD's general counsel and director of policy, 3 years as an attorney at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and I'm pleased to note, for those of you perhaps new to disability rights, Jeff played an indispensable role in one of the iconic moments in the history of the disability rights movement, the Deaf President Now movement at Gallaudet University in 1988, which was, in brief, an effort to establish plain and clear that a person who was deaf was every bit as capable of being the president of Gallaudet University as a person who was hearing, and because of Jeff's efforts and many other students who rallied a fairly aggressive effort, ensured that I. King Jordan became the first deaf president of Gallaudet University, and those principles, that spirit really permeates the ADA. So, Jeff, welcome.
That was a fantastic introduction. Thank you so much. He explained very well the council's role, and it's to be the voice of people in the federal government, to the voice in the federal government of talking about people with disabilities and their rights. And we work in a way that no federal agency could work. We talk to the administration, and the council offers constructive help, and in the spirit of previous councils. We help cause many reports to come out, including this one. I'm very happy and proud to continue this work. Now let's talk about the exciting panel. And I'm going to give their information to you in a very quick form, I hope. There's Eric Rosenthal, who is the founder and executive director of Disability Rights International, DRI. Sorry. On behalf of the NCD, he co-authored U.S. foreign policy and disability and helped bring about legislation requiring a change in our foreign policy, requiring that they include requirements for construction and accessibility for people with disabilities. And also, as part of the same board as myself, he's with U.S. International Council on Disabilities. And we also have another person here in the audience who's done a lot of work with USAID and CRPD in working with the rights of people with disabilities. He has worked for advocacy for people with disabilities. We have Janet Ward, who is currently a senior partner and director of human rights and inclusive development at Blue Law International. She's an adjunct professor at American University, where she co-teaches a course on international disability rights. For example, she has taught at National University of Ireland, Galway, as an adjunct professor, and she's at the University of Maryland Francis King Casey School of Law. And Alison Franco done a wonderful job as Director of Blue Law, International Human Rights and Exclusive Development Practice. She's worked with donor organizations around the world to develop and implement and enforce the legal frameworks that are consistent with the UN Council on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And she's a former board member too. She's now a special advisor to the towards full inclusion of people with disability, examining the rights and accessibility of overseas facilities and programs funded by the U.S. She worked at the World Bank and worked in disability development. Judy Goodman is a special advisor to International Disability Advisors, formerly at the Department of Education. Charlotte Plainman-Albo was employed by President Obama as the USAID Coordinator of Disability and Inclusive Development in December 2010. She has provided assistance and strategic support on how to include disabilities. Before she joined USAID, she was a senior operations specialist at the World Bank. Previous to joining the bank, on equipment side, President Nelson Mandela, she served as Commissioner of South Africa's Human Rights Commission. Thank you so much for being here, and thank all of you for being here. I'm sure it'll be a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks to the National Council on Disability, and thanks to the Washington College of Law for making this possible. Whenever I speak here, I always have to put in a plug and just my deep appreciation for the fact that my organization, Disability Rights International, was founded now 20 years ago as part of the law school here at American University. They incubated and set us up, and we've since become independent and doing international human rights work over the last 20 years, but it's always a pleasure to be back here and just deeply, deeply appreciative of the support people like Bob Dinerstein and Hadar have shown here at the law school. The fact that NCD is doing this report is extremely valuable and is an example of their sustained commitment to this issue over 10 years. I was hired 10 years ago, commissioned to write a report, Foreign Policy and Disability, that came out in 2003, that first raised these issues. I think it's important to understand this report in the context of a 10-year effort to bring about recognition of the rights of people with disabilities as a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy and as an essential element of international development efforts. Jonathan Young gave a fabulous overview as to why it is so important that people with disabilities be included in international foreign policy of the United States. The United States is the largest bilateral donor in the world. But more important, we're also recognized around the world as the innovator, as the pioneer of core disability rights principles. People know us as the country that adopted the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act, the idea that as a matter of civil rights law in the United States, not only is discrimination prohibited, but as a requirement that any U.S. government-funded program must be accessible and appropriate for people with disabilities, is a core principle that has been enormously influential. It's been influential on the drafting of the UN Disability Convention, and it's been influential on government development policies around the world. in the area of international human rights, where my organization specializes, the fact that the United States government comes out with country reports on human rights practices, and that we have law that says our foreign policy must respond to these core human rights principles, and that the rights of people, of all people, will be reflected in our foreign policy, is a key to the international human rights movement. Is the basic directive that influences our foreign policy. And the idea that people with disabilities historically have been overlooked, left out, not adequately recognized by that has an all-pervasive influence. The United States is a tremendous, tremendous leader, and what we do is watched around the world. So it is so important that we get this right. When NCD commissioned me and Professor Arlene Cantor to look at this, one of the core elements of the report at this time was an analysis of American civil rights law. Why was it that there was this interpretation that had been adopted by the State Department that American civil rights law simply did not apply to the foreign activities of our development efforts? That it would be illegal to build an inaccessible school at home, but if we're funding a school abroad, why shouldn't the same core civil rights principles apply? The State Department came out with a position that it does not, that there is no extraterritorial application. The USAID disability policy, which was then a very important step forward, also explicitly said the reason we have this policy is because our own civil rights law does not apply to our activities abroad. The core recommendation of the report in 2003 was, based upon a legal analysis of case law, there was no reason why extraterritorial application should not be recognized. There was case law to suggest that it was congressional intent that it would, in fact, be applied internationally. And as a matter of core principle, if we wanted to stand up for civil rights and international human rights of people with disabilities, we had to demonstrate by leading ourselves. That was the core recommendation, and I'm very pleased to see that 10 years later, that again is the recommendation, and that there is increased and even stronger case law to make that position. At the time the report in 2003 was adopted, there was a strong congressional response that something more needed to be done to improve the stature of disability rights in our foreign policy and to provide for the inclusion of people with disabilities. We were among, and I was working both on behalf of my organization and USAID at the time, the U.S. International Council on Disabilities, and in our discussions with congressional staff at the time about what the legislation should be, the question was, do we right now adopt the recommendation and establish explicitly that the civil rights law does apply and that AID, Department of Defense, Department of State have a binding requirement to make sure that their programs were accessible? At the time, there was a decision. Let's not bind these organizations. Let us see if they can do it voluntarily. Let's see if they can build it into their programs. There was legislation adopted that called on AID to abide by its own disability policy with the hope that that would do the trick. What I think this report does is provides us with a factual basis for saying 10 years later, did that work? Is it adequate to have a disability policy, or do we need to have binding legislation? And that's what we're going to hear from Alison DeFranco today as she presents her findings. It is important to recognize that there were other key recommendations at the time. We recommended that there be a funding stream created in Congress, that the barriers to entry by small disability organizations were so difficult. There were big beltway candidates that got all the big international money, and that to carve out a small grants program to allow disability organizations with expertise in the disability area to get involved in international affairs, that was legislation that came directly out of the NCD report. It was a tremendously valuable step forward. Congress adopted it, and we have now had a nearly 10-year history of that program in operation. Again, this is an opportunity to see how much impact that program has had. One of the other recommendations was that there needed to be a disability advisor in the Department of State and in the AID. And I'm very pleased to say that as a result of those recommendations, we have Judy Heumann and Charlotte McLean here today. Their presence and the fact that they are here is a direct response to the National Council on Disabilities' work in this area. So the great strides that we see moving forward as a result of their work, we can thank the NCD for making that possible. I want to emphasize that this report is not a report card on their work. Indeed, the factual research that was done for this report was done in 2010 and 2011, right at the time they were being appointed. So it really covers, in a sense, the 7 years between the adoption of the legislation requiring AID to abide by its disability policy and essentially them coming into office. What this report does do is provide a way to evaluate whether voluntary compliance with the disability policy is enough. It does not provide us with an opportunity to review the tremendous work that Judy and Charlotte have done at AID and State. And so that will be the focus, and we've asked both Judy and Charlotte to focus on the findings of this report and its recommendations, as opposed to simply talking about the work the very impressive work that they are now doing. There were other recommendations in this report that unfortunately Congress did not adopt, and I think are probably reflected in the fact that we have not seen more advance in this area. In other areas, such as the area of women's rights, AID adopted a whole program of women in development. The idea that there had to be focal points in every area of work to include women, that there had to be expertise within AID on women. And one of the signal calls in the 2003 report would be that as women had been included in development, so too people with disabilities had to be included in development, and there was a call for a similar kind of approach. AID and State did not adopt that. Congress never adopted those recommendations to create the resources for that. As a result, even though we have the fabulous work of Judy and Charlotte, what we do not have is the capacity building within State and AID, the expertise. There are a few key experts at AID and State, but nothing even approximately close to what, say, was done in the women's rights area. And again, now's our opportunity to evaluate, did that work? Is more need to be done? I'll just say in closing, the fact that we are talking so much about AID and State, sometimes it's easiest to see the areas where the light has been shining. The place that is darkest, where the light has not been shining, often gets overlooked. And probably the biggest funder, and perhaps the one with potentially the greatest influence on people with disabilities, is the Department of Defense. Unlike AID and State that have advisors in this area, they have no advisor. Unlike AID, for which there is a policy, there is no policy. I can tell you from the work that my organization has done, we have seen the Department of Defense actively building inaccessible buildings in many places of the world, and whoever thought that the Department of Defense was in the business of building institutions that would segregate people with disabilities from society. We have documented the extensive actions of the Department of Defense in building orphanages where children with disabilities are separated from society, and that's a terrible thing, and one of the recommendations of this report is that the Department of Defense needs to be held accountable. That is a tremendous area that really needs to be opened up. I will just say in one of the examples that is cited in this report of the Republic of Georgia, where at the time this report was written, AID had put out an RFP to rebuild a series of institutions for people with disabilities. The good news is that we were able to talk them out of it. So I just wanted to send that message of thanks to AID in Georgia that they decided not to rebuild that, but unfortunately the Department of Defense did step in and ended up rebuilding and in fact building an entirely new institution. With that background and that 10-year history, let's see where we stand today. Let's look at the findings that that Blue Law has come up with and see how the recommendations proceed. Allison?
All right, great, thanks. First, I want to also thank the National Council on Disability, and in particular, Joan DeRocher for putting up with me throughout this process, and Washington College of Law for hosting the event today. It's been a long time coming, so it's exciting to have this. I think that we've really set the stage for why this is an important topic. With over 1 billion people in the world with disabilities, with the high investment that the U.S. puts in foreign assistance, and with the fact that people with disabilities have the right to travel, work abroad, study abroad, and this, yeah, that makes it a lot easier. I don't hear myself twice. So I kind of just want to get right into what the methodology was that we used in the research and the findings that we found leading into the recommendations. To start, it was a very broad research topic looking at U.S.-funded overseas facilities, programs, and employment opportunities. We focused on the Department of State, USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, and Department of Defense, and to kind of keep the scope of research in a reasonable manner, we tailored to look at USAID programs. We looked at the State Department's country reports on human rights, as well as their accessibility, embassy accessibility, and cultural exchange programs. And then with the Department of Defense, we focused on infrastructure and new construction efforts. This was not because State Department doesn't have programs in other countries or USAID doesn't have infrastructure efforts. It was just to kind of narrow the scope and get a sense of what is happening across the board in U.S. foreign assistance. It also applies, although we looked at these three agencies, I think it really is applicable to all U.S. government agencies that are operating overseas, that have programs, facilities, employment opportunities. So to give you an idea of the methodology that was used once the actual breakout of what we were going to look at for each agency, it was a very mixed methods approach. We selected 20 countries where the U.S. invests a high amount of foreign assistance into development or infrastructure efforts from various regions of the world, looked at different amounts of money that they were receiving to kind of get a sense of countries that are receiving high levels versus less substantial amounts of funding. We also looked at certain programs and sectors that we specifically were interested in evaluating. After we selected those 20 countries, we worked with disabled people's organizations or disability advocates in the 20 countries to help us do in-country assessments. We were successful to have 14 of the 20 advocates actually go to USAID missions and U.S. embassies to interview personnel and to conduct accessibility assessments where they kind of just checked out the embassy. Does the elevator have appropriate signage? Does the elevator work first? Is there appropriate signage? Does it make the appropriate noise? stuff like that. The questions, the assessment questions, I believe, are at the end of the report if you're interested in that. The local advocates in each country also conducted interviews with USAID democracy and governance officers, where they discussed some of the programmatic implications, got an idea of what was happening around disability, got a general idea if the officers were familiar with the USAID disability policy. Those questions are also at the back of the report. In addition, we had focus group discussions. Many of those were led either via phone to get various regional mission officers on the phone and chatting, and we also had some local advocates run focus group discussions. There was an extensive desk-based document review of the technical guidance and publications that are put out by the various agencies that were examined. We followed up with a legal analysis, looking at what the civil rights implications that were discussed in 2003 and their impact. Are we now saying that U.S. civil rights law does apply extraterritorially, as well as the implications of the CRPD now that the U.S. is a signatory, and what it means when the U.S. is implementing programs in countries that have ratified. So just to, I guess, finalize the areas that we looked at in terms of programmatic, we were really looking at humanitarian assistance programs, democracy and governance, economic development, and cultural exchange programs. That gave us an array of different areas to examine in different situations and get a sense of how people with disabilities are being included in different sectors of development and foreign assistance. So to start off with the findings that came out of USAID, one of the major findings that we heard across the board from personnel throughout the world is a lack of knowledge on the disability policy or disability issues. They were not necessarily aware that USAID has a disability policy. When personnel were aware of the policy, they were not well acquainted with how to articulate its implications on their actual work. It should be noted that a lot of people were quite interested in learning more. They just weren't aware and really didn't have any understanding of how it impacted them. In the same vein, and where that really reflects, is many solicitations that were reviewed. So USAID requests for applications and requests for proposals failed to include the disability policy altogether. I believe that it was out of a sampling of 66 RFA, requests for applications in economic development and democracy and governance programming, 33 did not include the disability policy. So that's 50% failed to include the policy that is mandatory in solicitations. The next major finding was that a lot of the disability-specific funding that Eric mentioned has been used in manners that are not reflective of human rights and international development and inclusion that was initially intended. For example, some funding has been used to rebuild institutions and orphanages throughout the world, and that's kind of under the mandate World Disability Specific Funding. that's what I thought we were supposed to do, is help children with disabilities in the orphanage, and so that's where the money went. On another issue with the disability-specific programming, there has become, it's quite successful programming has occurred with disability programming that aims to build the capacity of disabled people's organizations, local civil society. There's small grants that go out for organizations to do disability-specific projects. So, for example, if there's a microfinance project, $300,000 grant for a disability group in Egypt. What this report, and following up on the 2003 report and the fact that that was implemented to create this funding, does highlight that there are issues with having what's called a twin track approach, where the funding is for disability specific and then you still have mainstream general development funding. There is yet to be a successful merging of these disability specific projects, where what the lessons we've learned from disability-specific projects and what mainstream development programs and implementers should build on have not yet come together. So just to give you an idea, one of the interesting numbers that I saw was in USAID Bangladesh. This was in 2010, so the funding would be slightly different. It had a $90 million budget. The mission had a $90 million budget. It had $300,000 go towards a program that built the capacity of local disabled people's organizations. That's a drop in the bucket, and there was no, in the interview and follow-up to that particular interview, no concept of why or how that particular group could be working with some of the other programs and projects in Bangladesh that were working to build civil society generally. And it just, it showed a lack of effective building on the disability-specific funding to actually ensure that there is inclusive development. In fact, it started to look like it's promoting a segregated approach. The next finding that came out of this was monitoring and evaluation efforts fail to apply a disability lens. This is not every single program or project in the world, but generally there's no disability lens or inclusion of disability in how we monitor and evaluate our projects. This has implications on future budgeting decisions, as USAID's 2010 evaluation policy states the importance of monitoring and evaluation, and the fact that when we see successful and effective projects and results, that's where we want to be budgeting for things. It's difficult to argue for more funding and inclusion of disability issues if we can't monitor and show where people with disabilities have been included or how disability issues have been included in existing programs. That being said, this is where I think we can successfully start looking at how to merge the smaller disability-specific projects, because there have been successful examples of monitoring and evaluation, and I think lessons that should be learned and utilized in larger scale programs. For example, we've seen both quantitative and qualitative methods used in the disability-specific projects for monitoring and evaluation. Quantitative, looking at the number of DPOs that were included in the trainings. Looking at the number of trainings that included human disability rights issues. Qualitative, case studies, focus group discussions, getting information from site visits, observations, learning more about what's happening within the project related to people with disabilities. So I think that although we are not yet seeing disability properly included and disability relevant indicators and targets, that is something that in the near future, I think we could take the experts on disability issues and have them work with mainstream development experts, and hopefully that will become a priority, that we can really look at how people with disabilities, disabled people's organizations, disability rights issues are being included throughout development programs.
Allison?
I just wanted to announce in terms of timing that we started late, and I've been told by the law school that we're welcome to stay here for an extra hour if we needed to. I don't want to impose on anyone, but I do want to give you the full opportunity to present your findings. So I just wanted to check with our other panelists whether they're okay if you go a little over. Charlotte, Judy, can you stay here, or are you? If you're going to have to leave, we can put you on.
1:45.
1:45. Okay. All right. So why don't you take another 5-7 minutes to wrap up, and then we'll try to move along. Okay.
I thought I'd only spoke for 2 minutes, but apparently I got longer than I thought. Really into talking about monitoring and evaluation. So yeah, I'll try to wrap this up a little bit, and so that we can hear from everyone, and then I'm happy to speak after with anyone. Another key finding we found in our desk-based document review is the failure of technical guidance and publications in various sectors to provide the how-to include persons with disabilities. In fact, in 2010, there was practically no mention of persons with disabilities or disability issues in any of the technical guidance documents related to humanitarian assistance out of OFDA, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance at USAID, as well as the Democracy and Governance publication series did not have much mention. And this kind of goes back to the program officers generally. I think that the lack of technical guidance makes it very difficult for people to know how to. It's easy for me to sit here and say, yeah, include people with disabilities, reach out to disabled people's organizations, blah, blah, blah. But if you're somebody who has worked for 20 years on election assessments and has never actually thought of how to, that's something that would be really useful and necessary to promote this further. And I think that's something that we're going to hear more about in a few minutes. I can skip a bunch of cards that are... Just to quickly breeze over to the Department of State findings. In 2003, can you just correct me, Eric, if I state anything wrong here, but the recommendation was to ensure that disability rights were included in the country reports across the board. Yeah. So in the 2009 country reports, we looked at all 194 reports. Pleased to say that 193 of the reports did include disability to some extent. There's definitely a vast difference between some of the reports that really reached out to different sources, media sources, government officials, disabled people's organizations, and dug into the issues, reported on the actual human rights abuses and potential solutions. Versus there were still many reports that basically mentioned if there was domestic disability law or not. So I think that looking at the model reports and the reports that have dug in to more specific detail will be important in the future. The The next thing in terms of embassy accessibility, as mentioned earlier, we looked at just general accessibility to an embassy building, both physical as well as communication information that's provided, and that really varied as well. One of the big findings was that security trumps accessibility. I don't totally know why a push-button door in a foreign embassy is not allowed to work because of security reasons when I see them throughout the United States without that concern. But if you're not familiar with push-button door, the door that you can push open and it opens automatically. That was actually one thing that many of the embassies that were visited and assessed did not have functioning. They had the door, they just wouldn't use it. There was also various documents and information that embassy officials would not provide in alternative formats, citing security concerns. Visa paperwork, passport information, certain things that they didn't want to provide electronically or in a manner that somebody who is visually impaired or has a print disability could utilize.
Wrap up.
Yes, yeah. Yeah. Let me just really quickly jump to Department of Defense, and I'll do the same thing I just did with the State Department and kind of throw in my recommendations at the same time. The Department of Defense, I think Eric actually did a really nice job of summing up, but that was, it's a harder nut to crack. I think in itself could be something that we'd really have to look at for a full project. The information that we could obtain was sparse because right away, somebody wasn't supposed to send you that, or that document's not allowed to be, viewed outside of the embassy. But they did in 2008 adopt new accessibility standards. Those standards are supposed to apply to new facilities, infrastructure, and construction efforts outside of the United States. However, at present, there are waivers and exceptions that have really made it impossible for those standards to really apply. So, as was mentioned earlier, I think there needs to be a lot done. Those waivers and exemptions need to be really reviewed and scrutinized. Also, the funding towards institutions, orphanages, and other like things need to be further evaluated. So I think I will hand it over to Janet for now. And
Thanks, Allison. Thanks, Eric. And thank you to Washington College of Law for hosting this event. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Bob Dinnerstein, and special thanks to Hadar Harris, who I'm very happy to and honored to call my colleague. You all are doing great things here, and it's just fabulous the extent to which your programming has been truly inclusive of disability rights, whether you're working on a quote-unquote mainstream human rights issue or doing more disability rights specific work. So wonderful work being done here and really teaching the new generation of disability rights lawyers, both on domestic disability law and also international disability rights. And thanks to NCD, it's been a pleasure to work on this project, and NCD's got a long history of working on international disability rights issues, and was certainly the very first organization in the U.S. that came out in full support of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and very, very early on convened several meetings bringing together folks in the American disability community and the mainstream human rights community. So NCD has really led the way all along, and we're still working on U.S. ratification, but I think this report is really very important and links, of course, to the and really important developments in the context of international disability rights. When we worked hard when we were drafting the treaty to get some language in it that did address the issue of inclusive development and the issue of inclusion in the context of humanitarian assistance programs. It's not an easy task in the context of the Human Rights Treaty to get that kind of language in there. We see international cooperation provisions in other types of treaties, often with stronger language, for example, in international environmental law, but it's a taller order, unfortunately, to get this kind of language in Human Rights Treaty. Governments don't like to be told how to spend their money or where to spend their money. So this rather innocuous provision, rather weak-looking provision, in fact, is very important, not only symbolically, but as an important hook to, and it has served as an impetus for governments, not only the United States, but many of the other bilateral and multilateral donors to start paying attention to disability rights and disability inclusion in the context of their programming. So one thing I can say on an optimistic note is that really we're no longer the Martians in the room that we were back in 2001, 2002, when a lot of us were working on inclusive development and human rights issues in the context of foreign assistance, and we talked about disability inclusion, and there was a lot of head scratching and sometimes worse than that, actually. So that has changed. We now have a conversation. Inclusive development is on the agenda. The adoption of the CRPD with Article 2 and the inclusive development mandate has generated a specific mandate for all UN agencies to get their act together, both internally in terms of personnel and also externally in terms of their programming. So there are things happening. Disability policies are being adopted by the EU, by the Australian Agency for International Development that has a pretty good disability strategy. It's still kind of organically being developed. They did actually finally throw out the disability prevention aspect of their programming that they threw into the disability strategy, put it back into public health. That's progress. So we see a lot of good things happening. But it remains the case that we have a long way to go. And we can't stop with, the weak provision in Article 32, because we still live in a world where some of the leading newspapers, like the Washington Post, can still say with great disdain that it's completely absurd to make a school in Afghanistan that's being funded by U.S. government money accessible for kids with disabilities. So we still live in that world. There is a lot of work that we need to do to obviously sensitize folks to the fact that actually it makes sense in Afghanistan, one of the most landmine-affected countries in the world, and a post-conflict affected country, to build schools that are accessible, not only for kids with disabilities, but for teachers with disabilities, for parents with disabilities. So we really do have a long way to go, but the adoption of the CRPD in Article 32, which recognizes the importance of international cooperation and its promotion of national efforts for inclusion, inclusive development, capacity building among disability organizations, and so on, that recognition is very important, but it doesn't end there. Because I think if our approach is disability inclusion, and if we in the disability community simply repeat that mantra that has been repeated for about 20-some years, what we get, I think, is including people with disabilities in a laundry list of vulnerable or marginalized groups that who should be beneficiaries of international development. That is great, but if that is our single message, or if that is my single advocacy message and approach in the context of talking to implementers and donors, please throw me out of the room, give me an F, because I failed. We need to move on. We need to, as Allison was talking about, demonstrate exactly how inclusion needs to take place. And we need to really push donors in the direction of going beyond this, let's include people with disabilities in our laundry list of marginalized groups who we have to reach somehow, without giving us any idea about how we actually do that. So we need to understand the experience of disability discrimination in the context of development, and we need to in the disability community be proactive in explaining how. So we need to go beyond Article 32 and look at what are the very specific implications of, for example, Article 29 on political participation when we are looking at every single aspect of a voting or political participation project in Egypt or in Libya or in Guatemala or wherever. And that takes technical expertise and it takes a level of specificity that better go beyond let's include people with disabilities in development. So, you know, pilot projects that have never been brought to scale are what we're going to continue getting unless we get a little bit smarter, unless we really educate ourselves about the business of international development, because it's a business. And it's a hard, competitive business, and it's often a pretty dirty business. You can get implementers out there to include a disability component in their proposal, and they never follow up and actually reach out and do what they're supposed to do, because they're interested in getting the money and then implementing the money, not necessarily in, you know, inviting the disability groups to, you know, contribute their expertise. So we better get smarter on the business side of things. And even more troubling, though, than sort of superficial inclusion and development projects are what, you know, Eric and Allison have talked about. We see institutions, orphanages being rebuilt or cleaned up. That's not what the CRPD requires. So again, go beyond Article 32 and look at the implications of Article 19, living independently in the community, and see how that should and can inform disability rights action within the context of international development. We see separate schools still being built for children with disabilities. That's not what the CRPD requires, but again, that's what we see happening still in the context of donor programs, unfortunately, around the world. So what we need to do is get smarter about international development. We need to be able to talk to donors and implementers and show them how it is that a court reform project operating in Indonesia for tens of millions of dollars can actually effectively include people with disabilities. How can that information bureau being set up within the context of a court in rural Indonesia actually ensure that its programs and its procedures and its facilities are able to reach persons with disabilities? That's going to take more than just reminding an implementer that inclusion should happen. How can we make sure that a microcredit program, for example, is accessible to persons with disabilities? How can we make sure, as Allison indicated, that a pre-election technical assessment addresses disability in a meaningful way, not a superficial way? To what extent are general public health programs or HIV and AIDS programs actually disaggregating data on the basis of disability, getting into looking at issues of monitoring and evaluation and so on?
Please wind up.
So there's a lot more work to be done. We need to use the CRPD as the tool that it is, beyond looking at Article 32, but looking at the very specific implications of all of the substantive obligations in it, use it as a tool to press forward on disability rights inclusion. And so I'm sort of optimistic in terms of what has been done by the adoption of the CRPD, by Article 32, but there is a whole lot more work that remains to be done.
Thanks very much, Janet. We're going to now move on to Judy Heumann and Charlotte at the Department of State and USAID. Again, I just wanted to emphasize the facts in the report date from 2010 and 2011. So in seeing these enormous challenges, these are the challenges that Judy and Charlotte face when they arrived at their respective agencies. And they certainly had their work cut out for them when they got there. Judy?
So I'd like to thank NCD and American University for sponsoring this event and for putting together this report. And I know that a lot of people are leaving, and I will speak really for a couple of minutes, but I'm also wondering, does anybody have any burning questions that you would like to ask any of us before you have to leave? Because we've been talking to you, and if you have any questions, we can also respond to those questions. Does anybody have anything you want to say, ask?
Can you just give
Yes.
contact information for people if they come think of something afterwards or whatever? So that we can...
As far as us at the State Department or USAID?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're happy to give you our cards at the end.
Okay, thanks.
And also, if you want to go and read the CRPD, or if you want to look at the legislation, the report that was submitted, when you come up after, we can give you that information for the linkages. So let me say that American University does not yet believe that it is where it needs to be on inclusion of disability, either in its law school or in any of its other programs. And I think it's important for us, I'm not looking at American University specifically, but I'm looking at universities around the United States and other state and federal agencies. So I believe it's important for us to put this in a context that while the United States has had many laws for many years in place, we are still all dealing with what needs to be done to help ensure that even within the United States, the staff that have responsibility for implementation at the state and federal and local levels are knowledgeable about what our laws are and knowledgeable about what their responsibilities are. Then when you come and look at foreign service officers and civil service workers who are doing international work, who have been trained in universities where the word disability never comes up at all, where there is no discussion about how disability fits into the broader context of the work that they're training people on in development, then we receive both at state and USAID and other federal agencies people who are at best knowledgeable about what U.S. law requires, may have some knowledge and experience about the fact that, oh, curb cuts are going in, and oh, by the way, these buses look accessible, and there have been some disabled people in our elementary schools and universities, and there may be a disabled person working hither, thither, and yon in the private and public sector in the United States. So I think that is the environment that we come into when we're working in agencies like the Department of State and USAID. So I think Charlotte and I have pretty much been going down the same path, both within our respective organizations and then our work to give messages to both staff within our agencies, as well as the work that we're doing with civil society organizations that are recipients of money from the federal government. We are working not just on the development and implementation of policies, but looking at what more specifically we can do to hold grantees responsible for the inclusion of disability in the work that they are doing. I think you know that the President is supportive of the CRPD. He's supportive of the work which is going on in our agencies, or our positions would not have been created. And one of his statements is disability rights aren't just civil rights to be enforced at home, they're universal rights to be recognized and promoted around the world. So we enter into these discussions with support from many. Let me, before I go on, I'd like to introduce Kathy Guernsey. I'm sorry I didn't do that before. Many of you may know Kathy. Kathy worked on the CRPD with Janet throughout its development and now works at the State Department and has been in our huge staff. Kathy has been the lead person also working on the report that Allison referenced, which is the Democracy Human Rights report that the State Department is mandated to do, and that NCD was involved with helping to get language that requires disability as a part of the reporting. I'm very happy to hear that 192 of the 193 countries mentioned disability. We, however, agree with you that the language that is in many of these reports is not yet where it needs to be. And actually, one of the very first efforts that we embarked on was having the person in charge of the Human Rights Report meet with a number of international DPOs and NGOs to begin to explain what the human rights reports are, because many organizations in the area of disability don't know what the human rights reports are, let alone that disability should be a requirement, or is a requirement as a part of the reporting. So work that has been going on in that area has both been training the editors, working with the writers, working with the embassies, and the reports are improving, but I think we would also agree that while the reports are better, there is more engagement in a number of with a number of the embassies to work with civil society in the communities to get stronger reports. We know that there's a lot more that needs to be done in that area. Let me say very quickly in the programming area, the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Office, where we're stationed, although my position works across the State Department itself, has adopted specific language on marginalized populations, including disability, and has linked that to the applications where there is weighting in the review of the applications. So marginalized populations within the review process is 30 points of the 100 points. And what it's meaning in DRL at this moment is that there is increasing knowledge on the part of the grant reviewers, so that those who are reviewing the grants themselves through our work and others are working to ensure that not only is language coming in the applications present, but there will also be monitoring and evaluation, which will follow up in part to address the point that Janet raised earlier, which is you can write something in about what you want to do in disability or anything, but if no one is going to be looking at what you've actually done, then it doesn't mean anything. So that's an issue which is being addressed. Now, programmatically also in state, we're working to get this policy adopted across the State Department. And we're hearing anecdotally from more and more people in the field that they not only are seeing that RFPs are coming out with disability explicitly mentioned in the RFPs, but there are more awards which are being awarded that are specifically inclusive of disability. In the education and cultural affairs area, let me be very brief. This is a very important component within the State Department. State brings people to the U.S. We send people out of the U.S. We have all kinds of different programs that advance knowledge of the U.S. overseas. We've seen increasing numbers of disabled individuals who are participating in those exchanges. A number of people in the room here have either been involved in meeting with people or been involved with the embassies on getting disabled individuals to be able to be participating in these programs. I want to mention the issue of employment, which also was referenced. Employment is a very important issue, obviously. I think when we look at issues like gender and LGBT and others, one of the reasons why state and USAID and domestic agencies are beginning to do better work in those areas is because people are being hired who both have personal experience as women or people from the LGBT community and are also able to apply their knowledge and expertise to the work that they're doing. In the State Department, we are seeing increasing numbers of disabled individuals, both with visible and invisible disabilities, that are being employed. We're pushing really hard on an internship program, which is a very big part of the State Department. Hundreds and hundreds of interns come into the State Department. And it's been very interesting to see that there are increasing numbers of disabled people who are not affiliated with any disability organizations. They are interested in this area. They're going to universities. They're learning about the programs. They're applying, and they're coming into the organizations. And I think that's a message for all of us, that many disabled people are not affiliated with any groups.
If you could please wind up.
I am. On the issue of accessibility, we can have a long discussion on that, both for ICT and physical accessibility, but there is work that's being done both in the adoption of standards within the organization as well as work that still needs to be done. Thank you.
Okay, Charlotte?
Thank you very much, Eric. And I, too, would like to thank Jeff, Joan, Hadar for the invitation to be here and to really formally accept or receive the report. USAID really takes the issue of stakeholder engagement and feedback very seriously, and thus we welcome this report. We believe that this is part of accountability and ultimately working towards an institution
or an agency that's more efficient and more effective. So really, thank you very much. We see this as valuable. I obviously have read the report, and I've put both on notice our deputy administrator and the head of policy, the existence of the report. And what I promise to do is that I will take this report back and ensure that all the relevant bureaus are informed of the report and are given the report so that they can provide a considered response to the recommendations contained in the report. I think, as everybody knows, there's much to be considered in the report, and the report really cuts across the breadth of the agency. And therefore, in order for us to respond, I think, in a serious manner to the report, it will be important to ensure that all of the sectors addressed in the report have an opportunity to think about what these recommendations mean. I did, however, want to mention that a number of the recommendations that have been made to USAID are actually in the works, and that I think is important. I also wanted to bring to your attention that there are a whole suite of new agency policies, including the USAID strategic framework that include disability. There's the gender equality and female empowerment policy that includes women and girls with disabilities. Across the agency. There's the youth policy, there's the water policy, there's the climate change policy, there's the global health initiative policy, there's the education strategy, there's the DG strategy, there's the upcoming urban policy, all that include disability. And so I think the message that I'm bringing here is that we have really worked to ensure the inclusion of disability into mainstream programs and strategies within the agency. And I think that that's a really strong part of mainstreaming, ensuring that you have that framework, you have that policy set up across the agency. We've also worked to ensure that the inclusion of disability it finds place in terms of interagency USG work. So the USG National Action Plan for Peace and Security, Resolution 1325, includes the issue of women and girls with disabilities. The National Plan for Children in Adversity also includes children with disabilities. And again, I think this really is saying that we're going beyond just a disability policy, but really trying to ensure that we're mainstreaming disability into other sector pieces of the agency's work. I wanted to say a few words on the issue of awareness raising and training of staff on disability inclusive development, because that was one of the issues raised in the report. And just to flag that we're about to finalize an online course that is essentially a 101 on disability inclusive development. We work very closely with UCID on this. And we've also contributed to other courses, other online courses within the agency, again in an effort to mainstream the issue across the agency. So in the gender-based violence online course, we've ensured that women and girls with disabilities, or at least a disability perspective, is included in that. I think we've done some considerable work ensuring that all the new staff, the new staff orientation now includes disability. We're also part of what is called the Development Leadership Initiative, and that is a program, a major recruitment program that enhances the agency's capability to deliver on USG foreign assistance. And we are part of that process. We are invited to all of those trainings, and we are talking about the issue of disability inclusive development. So, I mean, I think over the last 18 months, we've definitely had a series of roundtables, information meetings, events, agency notices. We've had at least 10 blogs on disability inclusive development. We've had public magazine articles that have gone out. We've had videos from missions on disabilities. We have set up a disability champion list that's very active, and it's a platform that serves to share information and views from people interested in the issue of disability. And this is all with a view to have that in-reach piece, to begin to train and to raise the awareness of disability within the agency. And I think that there's been quite a lot of support for that. So, for instance, disability was included in the recent Mission Directors Conference. It was included in the recent Program Officers Conference. It was included as an issue in the recent General Counsel and Regional Legal Advisors Conference. And this is important because these are platforms where you're bringing together all the mission directors, and you have on the floor an entire panel on disability inclusive development. So again, these are different mechanisms for outreach and for raising awareness on the issue. I did want to mention in terms of tools what I think is a very important tool, and that is the program cycle guidance. And this program cycle guidance addresses the issue of disability. And this is very important because what it does is it feeds into the development of the comprehensive development country strategies, which are really important because they set out the engagement between USAID and the host country. And related to that, that process has increasingly engaged DPOs in the consultation processes at country level around the country strategies. I did want to say that, as Judy had mentioned, we continue to work closely together with the State Department, and we've actually been cited by senior management as good practice, which is wonderful. And finally, I just wanted to say that, again, we really, really welcome this report, and that implementation of disability inclusive development is a cooperative exercise for us all. And I will take this report back and revert back to you on progress in terms of the recommendations. Thank you very much.
Excuse me? Sure.
Let me also say that, thank you. Prior to Secretary Clinton leaving, communication was given to the field that each one of the embassies is to identify what we're calling a point of contact. So we are working on getting individuals identified embassy by embassy, and all of the embassies have also been directed to hold a meeting with disabled people's organizations and others within 6 months of the information being sent to the field. So like Charlotte, State is also engaging disability as a part of the discussions across the organization. We've also been doing specific briefings for staff on the CRPD, particularly staff that have responsibility in human rights areas, so they at least get some more basic information about what the CRPD is and how to apply it. Thank you.
I know some of our panelists need to leave, so we've just got a few more minutes. Allison, as primary author of the report, do you have any last words or before we open up for questions?
I think let's open it up for questions.
Okay. David?
This came to me while you were speaking, Janet. The interplay between the U.S. government's foreign operations and the government in place in the country in which that work is going on. What's the dynamic there, particularly for these countries who have ratified the CRPD? If they've made a domestic commitment to realizing disability rights, are these governments advocating to the USG saying, your DOD is spending money in contrary where we're trying to go? Is that dialogue happening, or is that... This is for anyone.
Question, please.
I think the question was, in light of the CRPD and the commitment of countries to enforce it, are we getting feedback from the countries themselves criticizing us for not necessarily living up to those standards? Is that what you were...
Yeah, I would clarify that us meaning the U.S.
Meaning the U.S.
I guess 2 quick points. First, our Foreign Assistance Act requires us to follow the human rights standards in other countries. So those countries that have ratified the CRPD, we should be complying with their obligations. But interestingly enough, what we were told during research on the infrastructure and the countries that are building institutions or orphanages is the defense was always, well, that's what the local government requested. That's what they wanted. So I guess it goes into a whole circular thing that they may not even be aware of their obligations and how that's in violation of the CRPD when they're requesting.
But I don't think anybody should be surprised by that.
Second row and then the first row. Blue sweater.
Hi, I have a question for Charlotte, which is that the request for proposals that AID puts out generally are very demanding and have a lot of technical requirements. Especially in developing countries, a lot of DPOs don't have the capacity to successfully apply for those funds. Although sometimes they do benefit from capacity building activities that AID provides. Is there any sort of priority for AID to reach DPOs directly, or for the moment is it more about including disability-themed initiatives in AID's programming more generally?
Okay, so there is the overall priority at USAID, which is part of USAID Forward, and that's to make all of the processes around RFPs and RFAs a lot more plain, simple. So that process is happening. And it's not a process that has necessarily targeted disability. It's an agency-wide process to ensure that, A, we're looking at building capacity in country so that more CSOs, DPOs included can apply, but also so that the process of application is not so strenuous.
I think also, so there are a number of things that are going on here. One is there are larger grants which are being awarded both at state and USAID, which make it more difficult domestically or internationally for smaller DPOs to be successful. Both the fiduciary responsibilities which they will have and the administrative experiences that they've had. So one of the reasons why we're really encouraging that organizations that have been receiving funding from state or USAID know what's going on within the countries that they're working in is so that they can also in a meaningful way be awarding grants or whatever the approach may be that the larger recipient wants to use, but to meaningfully engage DPOs. Now, there are some countries like Ethiopia where they have a very strong group, a DPO, which has been an unusual organization that's really benefited in a number of ways from getting technical assistance, and now is being quite successful in getting grants from USAID that they wouldn't have been successful to get like 5 years ago because they didn't have the capacity. They have the capacity now. So the CRPD being effectively implemented also in countries that do provide money in general for civil society, where some of those organizations, DPOs, can also be getting funding to build their capacity to be able to effectively manage their grants. Because that is a big issue for any federal agency, whether it's domestic or international work. And if you look at some of the laws in the U.S., like in the area of Centers for Independent Living, there is a whole project that's been there for years, which is a technical assistance center for the CILs, for the exact reason that there has been a desire to help develop capacity, fiscal capacity, management capacity, as well as the substance of what the organizations have to do. So it's moving forward, and there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Karen in the front row.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful report. I recently touched back from Libya 2 days ago. and it's good to be around today for people back in the U.S. My question to you is this report going to any your old big NGO? Are you going to have this kind of discussion with in other forums like Interaction, stuff like that? Because the big NGOs need to be educated about health issues. They are remaining scared of the subject. Thank you.
It's a great question. I don't know whether Janet, Allison, or Jeff might have some thoughts on that.
This is Jeff. I want to commend everyone for the great things they're doing. And I really look forward to working more closely with you, the Department of State and USAID, to implement the report recommendations. To respond to your question, again, we are the voice of the people in the government, which means that we work closely with a lot of consumer organizations, advocacy organizations, small agencies. So we're hard-pressed to make sure that the information goes out. It is available on our website. We provide it on our listserv to talk, and we talk to strategic people who can use the information even more. So we welcome your information, and I'll be communicating with the right people, and you can help me with that. You could talk with me or talk with Joan, and I'll be happy to follow up on the issue you're talking about. And we need to think about ways to reach these people who need the information.
I think that's probably a great way to end the session today. Very productive discussion. Thank you all for my fellow panelists, NCD, the Washington College of Law. We'll make sure to continue to get the word out. Have a great day.